He didn't open the door because he was brave. He opened it because his dog wouldn't stop barking. Snow was falling sideways, wind clawing at the walls of the old mountain cabin, and the world outside had turned into a white void where mistakes disappeared without witnesses. On the porch sat a woman in a wheelchair, wrists bound to the armrests, tape sealing her mouth, frost clinging to her lashes like glass. She wasn't lost. She had been placed there, left where cold could finish what someone else had started. The veteran thought he was pulling a stranger out of a storm. He didn't know he was stepping into a trail of lies, hidden roots, and men who believed the mountains could keep their secrets. And somewhere in that same darkness, a child was waiting, leaving signs only the patient would ever see. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Stories like this remind us, sometimes the smallest act of kindness is the moment everything changes. Late winter dusk settled over the San Juan Mountains, Colorado. Wind combed through dark pines, and thick snow drifted sideways under a fading silver sky, swallowing the narrow road and the lonely cabin set back from the world. Bram Whitlock had learned to read weather the way other men read faces. At 60, he moved with a controlled economy that came from decades of discipline rather than youth. Tall, but slightly bowed at the shoulders, as if still carrying an invisible rucksack. His frame was lean, all tendon and old strength. Hands broad and scarred, knuckles swollen from years of tools and harder memories. His face was sharply cut, cheekbones pronounced, jaw square beneath a coarse gray beard he trimmed only when it annoyed him. A thin white scar traced from his left temple into his hairline, half hidden under short iron-gray hair clipped unevenly by his own hand. His eyes were a cold mountain blue, not unkind, just distant. The eyes of a man who had once looked too long at things no one should see. War had not made him cruel, only careful. He spoke little, distrusted noise, and believed solid wood, working engines, and honest silence were safer than people. The cabin behind him reflected that belief. Thick logs darkened by storms, a metal chimney patched twice, tools hung in perfect rows along the wall. He made his living repairing generators, sharpening chainsaws, fixing what winter broke for the scattered families down valley. Machines made sense. They failed for reasons. People did not. Sable lay near the door, a German shepherd in the heavy prime of 7 years, large even for the breed. Her coat was a dense blend of charcoal gray and deep sable brown, thick enough that snow clung to her like frost on bark. One ear bore a small split at the tip, an old injury that had healed crooked, giving her a permanent look of alert curiosity. Her amber eyes were steady and intelligent, never restless, always measuring. She was not affectionate in obvious ways. She did not paw for attention or lean into hands. Instead, she chose proximity, positioning herself where she could see doors, windows, and Bram's back at the same time. She had come into his life after a rescue shelter downstate could not place her, too watchful, too serious. Bram had recognized something familiar in that gaze, the quiet of a creature that had seen enough and decided loyalty was a decision, not a need. The wind rose, rattling loose snow against the cabin wall like handfuls of thrown sand. Bram added a log to the stove, listening to the crackle settle. He had just turned back toward his workbench when Sable's head lifted. It was subtle at first, a stillness, muscles tightening along her shoulders, ears angling forward. Then came the sound, sharp, urgent barking that tore through the cabin, not the low, territorial warning she used for deer or coyotes, but a higher, strained rhythm that vibrated with something close to alarm. Bram froze, heart kicking once hard against his ribs. Sable did not bark without reason. He crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling on his heavy canvas coat, boots already by the door. The handle burned cold in his hand as he opened it, and a storm shoved inward, wind and snow blasting across the threshold. For a second, the world was only white. Then shape returned. A wheelchair sat crooked near the edge of the porch, one wheel half buried in drifted snow. In it was a woman. Rope bound her wrists to the armrests, the fibers stiff with ice. Duct tape stretched across her mouth, edges crusted with frost. Snow layered her shoulders and hair until she looked less like a person and more like something left out and forgotten. Her coat was thin, the wrong kind of winter wear, city fabric meant for sidewalks, not mountains. Bram moved without speaking, boots crunching over ice. Up close, he saw she was in her mid-30s, perhaps, slender to the point of fragility, but not delicate. Her face was narrow, cheekbones high, skin pale beneath the cold, with freckles scattered across her nose and upper cheeks. Strands of light brown hair, almost blonde where snow melted into it, clung damply to her temples. Her eyes, hazel, flecked with green, were wide but focused, not wild. Fear lived there, but it was controlled, contained, like breath held too long. He cut the tape first. She sucked in air, chest hitching, but she did not cry out. He sliced the rope, lifted her. She was lighter than she should have been, and carried her inside. Sable backed away just enough to clear space, then repositioned between the open door and the rest of the cabin, body squared, ears forward, a silent barricade. Bram set the woman near the stove on folded blankets, hands already moving through the motions. More wood on the fire, kettle on the burner, gloves off, checking her fingers. They were swollen, skin darkening at the tips. Frostbite flirted with permanence. He wrapped them in warm cloth, movements firm but not rough. He kept distance in his posture, not touching more than needed, as if sudden gentleness might startle her. Up close, he saw details the storm had hidden. A small scar along her jawline, old and faint. The set of her mouth once it was free, determined, almost stubborn. She held her back straight, even while shivering, as if posture itself were armor. This was not someone used to surrender. Sable approached slowly, lowering her head to sniff the air near the woman's knee. No growl, no tension. After a moment, the dog sat, still between her and the door, but closer now, watchful rather than wary. The woman's voice came raw, each word scraped from a throat dry with cold. "My son," she said, not loud, not pleading, just certain. "Where is my son?" Bram paused, kettle hissing behind him. Something in his chest tightened, an old echo, another voice, another place, a cry he had reached too late to answer. He pushed it down, the way he always did. "You're safe," he said instead, voice low, even. She shook her head, eyes locking on his. "He's not." Snow hammered the walls. Inside the cabin, firelight flickered over wood and steel, and a rigid line of a man who had built his life on not getting involved.
He looked at the rope burns on her wrists, at the ice in her hair, at the dog who had already chosen to guard her, and felt the careful distance he kept from the world begin, quietly, to erode. Her lips trembled once, then steadied. "Orrin," she whispered, as if naming him might anchor him somewhere in the storm. Bram did not ask questions.
He handed her the mug when the water was ready, waited until her shaking hands closed around it, and stared into the fire, knowing the silence of his life had just cracked, and that beyond the walls, in the dark and falling snow, something had been set in motion that would not stop at his door. Night settled completely, the kind of mountain darkness that felt physical, pressing against the cabin walls as wind drove fresh snow sideways across the porch and erased the world beyond 10 feet. Inside, the stove burned steady, throwing amber light over wood grain and steel tools, over the rigid line of Bram Whitlock's shoulders as he crouched beside the wheelchair he had dragged in from the storm. Up close, under lamplight, the damage told a different story than the snow had. The right wheel was not merely bent. The metal rim had been twisted inward at a deliberate angle, torque applied with force and control. The axle housing bore fresh gouges, narrow and deep, as if struck by the hooked end of a crowbar. Paint had flaked in sharp crescents, not scraped by rock, but bitten by leverage. Bram ran a thumb over the metal, calloused skin reading it like braille. This had been done by hands that meant to disable, not by gravity or ice. Across the room, Lynette Carden watched him, shoulders still wrapped in a wool blanket, posture upright despite exhaustion. In firelight, her features were clearer. Narrow face, high cheekbones, dusted with faint freckles. Light brown hair drying in uneven waves around her shoulders. She looked like someone who had trained herself not to waste motion, each breath measured, each glance intentional. Her hazel-green eyes did not flit. They assessed. Fear lived there, yes, but it did not rule. Years earlier, precision had been her armor. Sable stood between Lynette and the door, weight evenly balanced on powerful legs, charcoal and sable coat haloed in orange light. The split at the tip of her ear cast a small, jagged shadow against the wall. She did not stare at the wheelchair. She watched Lynette's face, as if reading the space between heartbeats. Bram rose slowly, joints stiff but controlled, the movement of a man who had learned to conserve strength for when it mattered. "Not an accident," he said, voice low, gravel-edged. Lynette nodded once, not in surprise but in confirmation, as though she had expected him to see what others had missed. When she spoke, her voice had steadied, stripped of the raw edge from earlier. "They needed me slow," she said, "visible, predictable." She explained without drama, the way one might describe an office procedure. She had worked as a documentation clerk for a regional freight distributor that moved goods through the mountains, paperwork, manifests, shipping codes. The job had suited her temperament, order, structure, numbers lining up like soldiers on parade. She had been good at it, too good. One discrepancy had led to another, a pattern of shell companies and duplicate load IDs that pointed to cargo that existed on paper but nowhere else. Money washed through invoices that named no real destinations. She had printed a file to double-check a figure, then kept it, an instinct she could not explain at the time. That instinct had altered everything. A new detail surfaced as she spoke, The man who had noticed her questions first was not the owner, but a mid-level operations supervisor named Rafe Danner. She described him with the detached clarity of someone cataloging risk. Mid-40s, broad through the chest, with a wrestler's neck, and close-cropped black hair shot through with early gray. His beard was trimmed short and sharp along the jaw, giving his face a hard geometry. His eyes, she said, were pale and flat, the kind that never warmed, even when he smiled. Danner had once worked private security overseas, before drifting into logistics, a word he used like a shield. He prided himself on control, voices low, movements economical, anger delivered without spectacle. He had cornered her by the loading dock one evening, not touching her, not raising his voice, simply explaining that some numbers were not for her to balance. Lynette had gone home that night and copied the files. After that, accidents began to circle her life like slow vultures. Brakes failing on her car, a gas leak in her apartment building traced to faulty maintenance, phone calls with no one speaking. The wheelchair had come later, part truth, part tactic. An old hip injury from a childhood fall flared under stress, but she had learned to lean into the weakness, to become someone people overlooked. Bram listened without interruption, arms folded, back against the wall. Inside him, pieces aligned with a familiarity he disliked. Men like Danner existed in every theater. Different uniforms, same appetite for quiet dominance. He felt the old reflex stirring, the one that mapped exits and angles without permission. He tamped it down, focusing instead on the object before him. The chair was not just sabotage. It was a message. You move when we say. He turned the wheel once more, noting the precision of the bend. They didn't rush, he said. They took time. Lynette's mouth tightened. They always do. The stove ticked as metal expanded. Outside, wind thudded snow against the shutters. Sable shifted a single step, placing herself closer to Lynette's knee. The dog's amber eyes flicked once to Bram, then back to the woman, decision already made. In that small motion, Bram understood something that had nothing to do with metal or evidence. Sable did not weigh stories. She weighed pulse, breath, scent, truth that could not be rehearsed. The dog had chosen to guard Lynette as if she belonged inside the circle of protection. Bram felt the last of his internal distance erode, not in a rush, but like ice thinning under steady sun. Lynette drew a slow breath. "They won't expect help," she said. "Not here." There was no plea in it, only calculation. Bram studied her hands, long fingers, ink stains still faint at the cuticles from years of paperwork. A worker, not a fighter by trade, yet something in her posture said she had endured more than she showed. "What did you keep?" he asked. She met his gaze. "Enough," she answered. "Copies, roots, names tied to transfers." She did not say where she had hidden them. Trust, like heat, had to build gradually. Sable's ears twitched toward the door as a gust rattled the latch, then settled again. Bram knelt once more by the wheelchair, as if the act of examination anchored the conversation in something solid. "They wanted you alive," he said, half to himself. "Alive, but still." Lynette nodded. "Dead draws attention," she replied. "Missing can be explained. Crippled is convenient." The words hung in the air, heavy as the storm. Bram stood, joints creaking softly. He looked at the woman, at the dog guarding her, at the damaged wheel that proved intention where chance might have hidden. A quiet understanding formed, not spoken yet fully present. This night had not ended with a rescue. It had opened a line that led outward into shadowed roots and men who believed themselves unseen. The fire popped, sending sparks up the flue. Bram moved to add another log, the simple act grounding him. He did not promise anything. Promises were currency too often broken. But as he set the wood in place and watched flames catch, he knew one truth with the certainty of bone. The wheel had not been bent by fate, and neither, perhaps, had he. Dawn came late to the San Juan Mountains, the sky a dim iron gray that never quite brightened, snow falling in a soft, steady whisper that made the forest seem to breathe. Bram Whitlock stepped out of the cabin just as the wind shifted, closing the door behind him with care that came from habit rather than gentleness. Inside, Lynette Carden remained near the stove, wrapped in wool, posture upright despite the pain she concealed, her narrow face pale in the fading firelight, freckles faint against skin drawn tight by worry. Her hazel-green eyes followed Bram and Sable through the window, not pleading, not fragile, only watchful, like someone measuring distance in heartbeats. She had insisted she could manage for a few hours. He had not argued. Some strengths were quiet, and she carried hers like hidden steel. Sable paused at the porch steps, nose lifted, reading air currents invisible to Bram. Her thick charcoal and sable coat caught the pale light, frost already gathering along her back. The split tip of her ear twitched once, amber eyes narrowing as if tuning to a frequency the world rarely noticed. Bram held out the small knitted scarf Lynette had pressed into his hands before he left. It was child-sized, wool worn thin at the edges, faint scent of wood smoke and soap clinging to it. Sable leaned in, inhaling slowly, deeply, committing the pattern to memory the way she memorized the shape of her territory. When she stepped forward, it was without hesitation. The forest swallowed them within 10 strides. Snow softened their passage, but not enough to erase everything. Bram moved with deliberate quiet, boots finding the spaces between crusted drifts. At 60, his body no longer welcomed cold, but discipline carried him where comfort would not. He kept his shoulders loose, breathing measured, eyes scanning without darting. Years ago, he had learned to read terrain for ambush. Now, he read it for absence, for the places where something small had moved with care. He noticed the first sign where a low branch bent unnaturally, a single thread of blue yarn snagged in bark. Too thin for accident, too bright to be coincidence. He touched it with gloved fingers, felt the deliberate pull that had lodged it there. A child's signal, subtle but intentional. Sable circled once, confirming scent, then angled left. Bram followed. The snow here bore shallow scuffs, not the confident stride of adults, but the hesitant placement of small boots. Oren had not run. He had walked when watched and marked when unseen. Bram felt a tightening in his chest, not fear, but recognition. Courage did not always shout. Sometimes it left threads on branches and trusted someone would understand. The men who had taken the boy were not hunters by nature. Bram saw it in their trail when it crossed a frozen creek bed. Heavy boots, uneven spacing, a pattern of stops where they had likely smoked or argued. Professionals did not linger. These were transport hands, used to loading crates, not reading woods. Dangerous in groups, careless alone. That carelessness had given Oren space to work. They moved deeper,
pines rising dark and straight around them, the air colder where sunlight failed to reach. Another sign appeared, a smear of wool fibers against a rough trunk, the faint ghost of soap scent. Bram knelt, breath fogging the air. He imagined the boy pressing the scarf there, small hands steadying despite fear. "You're still thinking," he murmured, not loud enough to travel. Sable's tail lifted a fraction, as if she understood praise meant for someone else. Mid-morning never truly came. The sky remained dull, light diffused. Bram felt time differently out here, measured not in hours, but in tracks and signs. He found the folded scrap of paper where Linnet had said Oren liked to hide things, tucked into a split in an old fence post, half buried by drift. The paper was damp but intact, creased into a shape that kept its core dry. Inside was nothing written, only a rough pencil sketch, a square with a slanted roof and a single dot beside it. A building, a lantern? Bram studied the drawing, then the land. Old service roads cut through these woods decades ago, feeding small storage sheds and tool cabins. Many had been abandoned, but a few still stood, forgotten except by those who needed places without questions. Sable stiffened, head lifting. She had caught something new, metal scent, oil, human sweat layered over cold air. Bram felt his pulse slow, a strange calm settling over him like snow itself. The old reflex returned, not as panic, but as clarity. He was not the man he had been in war, but the skills had not vanished. They had only waited. He adjusted his path, keeping downwind, using the rise of terrain to shield their approach. They reached a shallow ridge and looked down into a narrow clearing. There, half hidden by leaning spruce, stood a small utility shed, roof sagging under snow. A faint thread of smoke curled from a pipe improvised through the wall. Footprints circled it, then disappeared under fresh fall. Bram's jaw tightened. The drawing had been right, but he did not move closer. Not yet. Oren's signs had led him here. Rushing would betray the boy's careful work. Instead, he studied the edges of the clearing, the drift patterns, the places where someone had stepped to relieve themselves or throw out trash. He saw a candy wrapper half buried, bright red against white. Not the boy's, too carelessly dropped. These men underestimated stillness. Sable sat beside him, gaze fixed on the shed, body coiled but controlled. She did not whine or paw. She simply waited, trusting Bram to decide when to act. He placed a hand briefly on her neck, fingers sinking into thick fur. Warmth met cold, a living anchor. Inside the shed, unseen but imagined, was a child who had turned fear into signals. Outside, an old soldier learned again how to listen to small voices. Bram exhaled slowly, committing the layout to memory. The door hinge direction, the slope of ground, the line of trees that could hide movement. This was not the moment for heroics. It was the moment for patience. The forest held its breath with them. Somewhere within the structure, a lantern shifted, light flickering through a crack like a pulse. Bram felt the quiet weight of responsibility settle fully on his shoulders. He had not come too late. He had come to the edge of the right place, at the right time. And for the first time in years, the skills he once carried like burdens felt like tools again, shaped not to destroy, but to return someone home. The second night folded over the mountains with heavier snow, wind rising in long, low gusts that blurred edges and carried sound sideways.
turning the forest into a moving curtain. Bram Whitlock waited on the ridge above the clearing until the gusts aligned with his breathing, until the white noise of weather would swallow the small betrayals of human movement. At 60, his body no longer tolerated hurry, but patience had become a tool sharper than any blade. Beside him, Sable held still, charcoal and sable coat dusted white, split ear angled toward the shed below. Her amber eyes did not leave the door. She seemed less like a dog than a boundary drawn in fur and muscle. Two men circled the structure in a pattern Bram had mapped from memory. They were transport hands, not woodsmen, and their confidence had grown lazy with the hours. One was Kellen Brost, tall and thick-shouldered, early 30s, with a blunt nose and stubble shadowing a jaw he chewed when nervous. His heavy parka hung open despite the cold, a sign of impatience that had gotten him frost-nipped once before, leaving a pale scar along his left cheek. The other, Merrick Slade, narrower, late 20s, dark hair falling into his eyes, movements quick and restless. He had a habit of rubbing his thumb against his index finger as if counting coins, a tic born from years of loading docks and small-time hustles where money passed hand to hand. Neither carried himself like a professional soldier. They spoke little, shoulders hunched against weather, boots stamping warmth back into their feet between slow circuits. Bram watched until the shift he had anticipated arrived. Brost turned his back to the shed to relieve himself behind a spruce, while Slade trudged to the far corner to check a sagging tarp. Wind surged, driving snow hard against the wall, a white roar. Bram moved then, sliding down slope in the lee of the ridge, steps placed in the troughs between drifts. Sable flowed ahead, low and silent, nose cutting the air. She stopped with a sudden stillness near the rear wall, one paw lifted. Bram saw it a breath later, a crude tripline of fishing cord strung ankle-high between two bent nails. He crouched, gloved fingers finding the tension point, easing it free without letting the bell tied at the end tremble. The bell did not ring. The wind did the rest. The back of the shed held a warped plank that had been pried before. A gap no wider than a hand offered entry. Bram slid through, shoulders brushing rough wood. Inside, kerosene and damp wool layered the air. A lantern burned low on a crate, flame shivering with each gust that slipped through seams. Against the far wall sat Orrin, smaller than Bram had pictured, elbows and knees tucked close around a backpack. His dark hair fell unevenly over wide brown eyes that held stillness older than his years. He did not cry out. He did not move until Sable's shape appeared in the gap of light. Recognition traveled between them without sound, his shoulders eased by a fraction, breath loosening. Bram crossed the space in 3 careful steps and knelt, one hand steady at the boy's back, the other cupping the back of his head. "We go quiet," he breathed, not a command, but a pact. Orrin nodded once, jaw tight, fingers gripping the straps of his pack as if it anchored him to something solid. Bram lifted him, surprised again by the lightness, the way fear burned calories from small bodies. Sable backed toward the door, positioning herself broadside to the room, not baring teeth, not bristling, simply present, a silhouette that suggested consequence. A boot scraped outside. Slade's shadow cut across the crack of the door as he turned the corner too soon. He saw the movement, eyes widening, and shouted, a short, startled sound swallowed by wind. Brost rounded from the trees, face red with cold and anger. Bram did not sprint, he angled. He slipped out the rear gap, turning upslope into the wind, where sound shredded and scent scattered. Sable fell in beside him, then drifted back to the shed's front for a heartbeat, blocking the doorway with her body, head high, ears forward. The men slowed, uncertainty stalling them. Instinct told them a bite would come, but none did. The absence of violence confused more than a snarl would have. By the time they pushed past, Bram and Oren were already threading between trees where drifts hid their tracks. Snow deepened with each step. Bram chose the long route along the frozen creek bed, where wind polished the surface and erased sign. Oren held still against his chest, face buried in canvas and wool, breath warm through fabric. Behind them, shouts rose and fell, then scattered. Brost and Slade tried to follow, but they were men of straight lines, and the mountain spoke in curves. Twice Bram doubled back under overhangs of spruce. Once he stepped into the creek's hard sheen and walked 30 paces before exiting where wind had scoured the bank. Sable ranged wide, returning to press her shoulder briefly against Bram's knee. A check-in, a count of 3 made whole. Halfway to the ridge, Oren stirred, whispering a single word into the dark. "Mom?" Bram felt the syllable in his ribs. "She's waiting," he answered, truth carried in the same quiet tone he used for everything that mattered. The boy's grip loosened, trust settling like a weight that steadied rather than burdened. They reached the ridge as the sky paled from iron to diluted slate. The storm eased a fraction, enough for distance to open between them and the shed. Below, 2 figures moved without direction, their calls thinning into the trees. Bram did not look back long. He had learned that victory could become arrogance if stared at too hard. He shifted Oren to a more comfortable hold and began the descent toward the cabin, steps measured, breath even, Sable's outline pacing the edge of his vision. By the time the cabin roof emerged through branches, the first weak line of dawn traced the horizon. Smoke lifted from the chimney in a thin, gray ribbon. Lynette stood just inside the doorway, blanket around her shoulders, posture straight as a drawn line. When she saw the shape in Bram's arms, something in her face broke open. Not loudly, not in sobs, but in a release of breath that seemed to unspool months of held tension. Bram crossed the threshold and set Oren down, stepping back as mother and child closed the distance themselves. Sable entered last, turning once to face the forest before settling near the door, guardian even in quiet. Outside, the wind combed the pines, indifferent. Inside, warmth gathered around 3 living hearts, and the steady presence of a dog who had held a line no weapon could draw. Spring did not arrive all at once in the San Juan Mountains. It crept in the way forgiveness does, quietly, almost suspiciously. Snow loosening its grip in thin patches that revealed dark earth beneath. Streams muttering under ice. The sky stretching wider each day. The night of the rescue faded into official voices and measured procedures. Sheriff Alton Rusk, a broad, weathered man in his late 50s, with a square jaw and a gray mustache thick as winter brush, arrived at the cabin 2 days later, with deputies in heavy parkas and tired eyes. Rusk moved like a man shaped by rural patience, slow to judge, quicker to observe. Years ago, a logging accident had taken 2 fingers from his left hand, and the loss had carved caution into his temperament. He listened more than he spoke, gaze steady on Lynette Carden as she sat upright by the table, freckles faint against skin no longer blue with cold, hazel green eyes clear and unwavering. When she handed over a sealed envelope, copies of freight records, route codes, names, her fingers did not tremble. Orrin sat beside her, small shoulders squared, dark hair still uneven, eyes older than childhood allowed. He held Sable's thick fur in one hand, as if contact anchored him to the present. Bram Whitlock stood near the window, tall frame still slightly bowed, gray beard trimmed short now that winter had eased, cold blue eyes watching the yard as if threats might rise from melting snow. He answered questions simply, without embroidery, voice low and level. When Rusk later mentioned compensation, state funds for assistance in recovery, Bram shook his head once. "Some things," he said, each word deliberate as a nail driven straight, "you do because they need doing." Rusk studied him a moment, then nodded, understanding without agreement. Men like Bram did not trade actions for praise. They measured worth in outcomes, not headlines. Lynette and Orrin left under escort before roads fully cleared, names already shifting in paperwork, the machinery of witness protection grinding quietly into motion. The cabin returned to stillness, yet it was a different silence than before, less like absence, more like breath between sentences. Bram repaired fences, split wood he no longer urgently needed, hands moving through routine while something inside him adjusted to an unfamiliar weightlessness. Sable followed as always, her 7-year-old body strong but easing, winter coat finning in patches where silver gray lightened toward summer tones. She slept more deeply now, ears twitching only at true sounds, not imagined ones. Months passed. Snow retreated upslope, leaving the road open and the sky washed clean. One morning, a letter waited on Bram's table, envelope plain, handwriting precise. He recognized the careful, upright script. Lynette wrote that she and Orrin were settled in a town east of the range, small enough that strangers were noticed but not interrogated. She had opened a modest auto repair shop with an attached parts shed, skills from paperwork now turned toward inventory and honest transactions. She did not ask for help. She offered a place. "Work if you want it," she wrote. "Space. Nothing owed." Bram read the letter twice, then set it beside his mug. Sable nudged his knee once, tail giving a slow, certain sweep. The town smelled different from the mountains, less pine, more oil and sun-warmed pavement. The shop sat at the edge of a side street, sign hand-painted, bays wide enough for pickups and tractors. Lynette stood outside when Bram's truck pulled in, taller than memory allowed, posture still straight, light brown hair pulled into a practical knot, freckles brightened by sun. She moved with care but not apology, hip stiff on colder mornings, yet steady. Orrin burst from the side door, limbs longer, laughter easier now, eyes still observant but no longer guarded. He spoke to Sable as if the dog had always belonged to his life, voice light, hands confident in the fur he trusted. Bram found work the way he found trails, by stepping into them. He handled books in the evenings, broad fingers surprisingly deft with numbers, then moved to engines during the day, tools familiar as breath. He spoke little. The town learned his shape and left him to it. Sheriff Rusk called once to say the case had widened, that men like Rafe Danner were answering questions they could not dodge. Bram listened, offered nothing beyond a quiet, "good." The hidden message of the months settled around him. Safety was not built by grand gestures, but by small, steady acts repeated until fear loosened its hold. Sable chose a place just outside the shop door, where sun pooled on concrete. She stretched there often, eyes half closed, body angled so she could see both the street and the people she had claimed. Her breathing slowed into a deep, even rhythm, the kind of sleep that comes only when vigilance finally loosens its grip. Bram watched her once, grease dark on his hands, and felt a quiet realization settle in him like thawed ground accepting seed. Belonging was not a place you reached. It was a line you held long enough that others could stand inside it without flinching. One afternoon, as wind carried the smell of rain instead of snow, Oren's laughter rang across the lot, bright and ordinary. Lynette stood in the doorway, coffee in hand, eyes meeting Bram's over the hood of an open engine. No words passed, none needed. The past had not vanished, but it had been folded into something usable, like scars that let a body move more wisely. Above them, clouds drifted wide and harmless, and in the easy sprawl of a German shepherd sleeping in sunlight, there was a quiet promise the mountains had never made, but this place now did. Tonight, no one would be left in the cold. Sometimes heroes don't wear uniforms anymore. Sometimes they live quietly, fix engines, split wood, and try to forget the noise they once survived. But when someone is left out in the cold, literally, or in life, the heart remembers what the mind tried to bury. Bram didn't save a life because he wanted to be brave. He opened the door because not opening it would have cost him something far greater than danger. It would have cost him who he truly was. And Sable reminds us of something simple but powerful. Loyalty doesn't speak. It stands. It stays. It guards warmth when the world turns cruel. Oren's small threads, Lynette's quiet strength, Bram's patience, and Sable's watchful presence all whisper the same truth. Courage is often quiet. Kindness is often inconvenient, and the right thing is rarely loud. But it changes everything.